As Donald Trump tests and even defies limits on presidential power, we are hearing again about checks and balances.
There are supposed to be checks and balances, and it is essential that both Congress and the court do their job to check the president.
It sounds like he's trying to do away with every kind of check and balance.
The power of one must check and balance the other.
The last line, a true reference to John Adams, played by Paul Giamatti in the HBO rendition, one of the founding fathers who built the checks on power which try to protect our democracy. A lot of these are well known. They're taught in school. Instead of a king who wields all power, the U.S. very deliberately divided power across the government. Sounds familiar to most people who've dabbled in any American civics. So Congress gets to write laws and spend the money. The executive branch gets to enforce them and lead the whole federal government within law. Courts then interpret those laws and make their rulings. Paul Giamatti, as John Adams, broke down that as a function of not only divided power across those branches that I mentioned, but also on federalism.
Our nation cannot bind together without powerful central government, but we must also accommodate the needs of our constituent states. The power of one must check and balance the other.
The states. That is Adams on checks and balances, and he goes beyond just the branches I mentioned, right? The federal branches, executive, legislative, the courts. He talks about curbing powers in the central government versus the states, because the states were always and have always been the other check on runaway power. The Constitution says federal authorities are specifically delegated, and the remaining powers are reserved to the states. Simple. Clear. And it's one thing the founders got right. They worried about power grabs. What if one party controlled the White House and the Congress? What if those members of Congress abandoned checking power of, say, a White House they largely agreed with? What if courts were slow to curb a president and his aides rushing power grabs? The rules were built precisely in response to bad experiences with authoritarian rule and kings, and today the states have their own powers. This is often called states' rights or federalism, which refers to this constitutional division. And the founders didn't want the president ruling like a king. That's why they said anything not deemed delegated for federal powers under the president and those authorities goes to the states. Now, this is all front of mind now as Donald Trump either skirts or outright defies laws, tests his powers, and is daring anyone to stop him. Now, we've been covering Trump orders that have at least been already paused by the courts. He failed in a bid to rewrite the Constitution's citizenship rules. Others could have a lot of impact because courts can be slow. But here's the key point I want to share with you right now in our special report. These state powers could matter even more. It's a domain where, remember, there's a whole separate government. It's not just the federal government and Donald Trump. There are the state prosecutors, police, state funding, and state political leaders. There are the governors in the states that have their separate powers. And some of them are just using them to work and govern their state. Others, though, with how far-reaching Trump wants to be, are trying to counter his efforts. And this might sound so familiar, you're like, okay, why is the anchorman putting this on the news tonight? Well, it's familiar if you're watching in America and you know our civics, but it's actually unusual. It is different than most countries, which don't have a main government and then 50 sets of laws in other governments. This is an American thing for the most part, America's special federalism, however wonky, and it is at work under threat from someone who has all but said he'd like to be a partial dictator, at least some of the time. So we're watching Democrats deploy this state authority I'm telling you about, sometimes directly against MAGA policies that encroach, patrolling what they argue could be even unlawful, unconstitutional moves by Trump. The states have this special solicitude. They can sue the administration. This is how the Times explains it. They can bring these lawsuits claiming their rights or the rights of their citizens have been violated. The Times is covering this right now for the same reason we've been preparing this report, because if you follow the facts, the states matter. And you can see this in even simple moments. Trump has been trying to avoid the congressional Democrats in the minority, but he has to face governors, particularly when he goes there to their states. Here was Democrat Gavin Newsom. Two leaders of two separate governments within the United States overseeing different laws, state laws and state police there in California and state firefighters versus the feds under the president. And many state officials, seeing what's happening, have been vowing to step it up.
I feel ready, as now a governor of Washington State, to stand up to the Trump administration.
My duty is to all of you.
We're not going to stop supporting and having the backs of communities and individuals whose values or very lives are being attacked.
Connecticut has never quit on people. We're never going to surrender.
I have one message for President Trump. I'll see you in court.
And it's true. Those vows are in action. That's part of why we have so many court cases. They've been using their power. Regular citizens can sue in certain scenarios, of course, but not at the speed and not with the sort of power in the Constitution that states have. So those early executive orders were signed in Sharpie. Their impact, though, may not be in stone. Now, I want to be clear with you and precise. This isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. The feds have powers over immigration enforcement at the border. That's first a federal thing. But Trump's early moves have actually been blocked in courts and faced a clash in the states when he has broken, for example, with past conservative vows to respect the states and their authorities, instead trying to coerce state police, state resources to join his deportation agenda. And so we've had local leaders pushing back on that. It's something former mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, talked to us about in our coverage about how some of this stuff is more complicated than Donald Trump would have you think, and discussing those efforts all the way back to Trump's first term.
I think what is being misunderstood here is the limits of presidential power. Donald Trump early on attempted to take away our security funding for New York City, number one terror target in New York in the nation, tried to take away the security funding, the Homeland Security funding, because we were a sanctuary city, except we were able to successfully sue and stop that.
The Omaha Police Department has no plans to participate in any raids. Omaha police officers do not and will not stop individuals to check their legal status. This is not the mission or duty of the Omaha Police Department.
Roundups out in the community and those kinds of things, that's not my job.
And that's just what we're hearing in what is, again, the very early days of this administration. On the deeper level, this is the ancient U.S. distribution of power. The president cannot seize local police, order around the local governments, rewrite state laws, cannot use soldiers inside the United States, nor station them in people's homes inside the states. Some of these limits go back a long way. Now, Trump's most binding use of federal power in his first weeks in office was those pardons, ending federal convictions in prison for all of those Jan 6 attackers. Now, in contrast to some of the other orders that are getting tripped up, this one is solely federal power over federal cases, and it can't be paused or reversed. And notice we haven't seen any court, any judge say otherwise. But there are limits on the reach of this issue. Remember, the Constitution gives the president authority over offenses against the U.S. Shall grant reprieves and pardons for those offenses. Now, that limit matters more right now than it did, say, last year, because while those federal cases are over, state cases and convictions for other MAGA election offenses continue. And President Trump cannot interfere, let alone pardon them. He cannot call up a state or tweet and demand that states abandon their police powers in their cases. He just has no power there. These are state powers wielded by local law enforcement overseen by governors. Same for any Trump aides in trouble in the states. There is one who got a federal pardon in the first term over a federal case that is awaiting a trial in New York State. Steve Bannon, who has been well known as a big leader in the Trump era, whatever happens in that case, and like anyone else, he'd be presumed innocent before trial, but whatever happens, it'll happen with the state and those New York powers. Nothing to do with the feds. Trump's largely unprecedented Jan 6 pardons also has some state prosecutors even exploring whether there are ways they could charge others locally, although that could be complicated by limits against being tried twice. But anyone lawfully charged or convicted in a state can't be saved by any president. Now, the pardoned rioters could return to their states emboldened. We've heard warnings about this. But again, because of what I'm telling you about, state powers, federalism in the Constitution, any help they get from President Trump will not protect them in these 50 states. And then there are policy clashes with states that aren't unique to Trump. States have to work out solutions when national policies require cooperation. There are clashes. President Obama saw governors test compliance with his health care policies. Now some states are squaring up against the impact from Trump-appointed justices, overturning the precedent of Roe v. Wade. So you had 10 more conservative states, I should say, no, over 10, 20 more conservative states enacting abortion bans, but then another 25 using their state powers and their state laws to push back. And there are even new laws and referendums to protect abortion or stop the reach of those federal efforts, which keeps abortion accessible. This goes beyond partisan politics or your feelings about Donald Trump, which have been well discussed across the nation. Those are state efforts against restrictions on abortion, and it included purple and red-leaning states like Kansas. John Adams and the founders would at least be happy to see that concept hold some 235 years later. States using their powers, local democracy, pushing against some federal power grab. Although while we're looking backwards, they might be shocked the pushback was for women's rights, including women voting, which of course wasn't happening back then. Now, Republicans have spent decades claiming to be for states' rights when it suited them. Now we have Republican leaders who are trying to seize power from states, like I mentioned, to dictate abortion policies or to restrict women from traveling between states. There are even some Republican efforts to try to then reach in and control the policy within other states, which flatly contradicts the constitutional federalism I'm reminding you of tonight, as well as what Republicans have been saying for a long time. And you got to keep this in mind. It's big news this week as states and state lawsuits are curbing or at least pausing some of Trump's powers, which is the type of thing Republicans used to claim to be for. They would lean on state powers and state rights. Indeed, even in the Roe and abortion debate, that was one of their talking points.
States should decide the issue of abortion. Let the individual states make their abortion policy.
They all wanted this issue to be brought back to the states where the people could vote.
Back to the states. And yet, after claiming they want less government power and states to make the decisions, we have seen many, not all, by the way, but many Republicans just say the heck with everything we've ever said and claim to govern on and vowed in our campaigns. We're just going to try to drive and override the states when it suits them. There's even talk of a federal abortion ban if they got the votes. And that would override the states. It would ban abortion just as much in California as it would in Florida. Now, the founders talked about the power of one must check and balance the power of the others. And there are different ways that government power does ebb and flow across history. Indeed, even in times of great constitutional crisis and tension, it is worthwhile to remember some of the lessons of the past. We don't have to do this all in crisis or just with the claims of the day. Federalism, this type of state power, clearly matters. And if you go back to the civil rights movement, we saw this same debate play out through these issues, where the government wanted to defend these rights after such a long and tortured history. There were breakthroughs. There was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And at that time, again, if you want to really remember your history, maybe one of the reasons that the states' rights thing cut more ice with some Republicans and conservatives was the same sort of distortion we're seeing on abortion. That states' rights was only of interest when it fit other agendas. And in the civil rights era, it was well known that it was a talking point and a cover for trying to defend a state-based Jim Crow, Southern, racist, white supremacy way of life down there. You know, as you get back past that, you still had a lot of talk about it. You had Ronald Reagan, other GOP leaders, whether it was on states' rights or the wider concern of the power of the federal government, warning. Even as we see a Republican president try to do this right now, remember, it was Republicans warning about exactly the federal government having too much power.
We must remove government's smothering hand from where it does harm. We must seek to revitalize the proper functions of government. But we do these things to set loose again the energy and the ingenuity of the American people.
Our towns and our cities, then our counties, then our states, then our regional compacts, and only then the national government.
It's time to have power go back from Washington to the states and to the cities of this country all over America.
And he must see to it that government intrudes as little as possible in the lives of the people.
Intrude as little as possible in your life. That was a very modern, contemporary, pretty recent definition of limited government. Just as those calls to revert power first and foremost to the states was not only what Republicans said, but what arch-conservatives said, like Barry Goldwater. The idea that you would want a larger and larger role for the federal government in people's lives, overriding basic human rights, your way of life, what you do in your home, with your doctor, with your family, those decisions, that was the antithesis of conservatism, which we were told by the state conservatives and the federal candidates and the hard right like Goldwater and the mainstream, more palatable conservatives like Reagan. That was one thing they all said they agreed on. Some of this will be fought out over time. The past efforts to abuse the FBI or seize executive powers did take years to address, and there were real human costs along the way. None of our report tonight, none of the evidence we've gathered is saying to you that you can just chill out and not worry about any of this. There are things to address. But the efforts by hungry or hypocritical politicians at the federal level to break down the entire governmental system, from the courts to the state powers, those have not generally worked in the long run. We have been tested, but people have risen up. Power has pushed back in the courts and at the states. And while a president may pardon those violent crimes, as I mentioned, that are federal, the states still have their prosecutors and their police powers. And we have every indication from these governors that anyone emboldened by MAGA pardons who thinks they can go commit violence in any of the 50 states will find a different result and no pardon pending. We also have a new attorney general that says they will not only go on with Trump's agenda here, but they want to target federal and state prosecutors who pursue those cases. Notice that is exactly the power I told you about, protected in the Constitution. And now, within the first days of office, they are trying to go after the states and those state powers, although we don't have any reason to think the Supreme Court would look kindly on that kind of blatant political abuse of federal power. And our country braces for the real threat that comes amidst all of this. But even these freed MAGA felons who probably benefit from the most extreme and irreversible use of federal power Trump has done in these few weeks, they can only get help for those federal crimes, meaning actions against the feds are in D.C. In the vast majority of the country, federalism empowers the states to run the prosecutions and any potential pardons. And if you're counting, that's 98% of the prosecutions. Only a sliver of these kind of law enforcement matters are ever done at the federal level. The states, as John Adams said, take the lead. Now, that is just one of many examples. But I showed you those past politicians to remind you that not everything being claimed, hypocritically or otherwise, has the half-life of another campaign cycle. And some of what is in the Constitution, even though it has become almost automatic or trendy to criticize so much of our history, and we've done it here on this program, I know why we do it. But some of those rules in the Constitution were thought out because they had seen the abuse of power before, and it's axiomatic and understood that elections would sometimes, again, re-anoint people who might abuse that federal power. It is precisely because they saw, if not this example and this name, but this prospect of this threat, that they divided the powers among the federal branches and divided them yet again among the states. It's one good idea that lives on today, and that will be a big part of the pushback to efforts to abuse the Constitution and federal power this year and in these years to come.